Good evening and welcome to the City Council Oversight Committee meeting of Thursday, December 12th, 2024. Okay, too close to me. Two items on the agenda. The first of these, here we go. It was Rick did it. First of these is presentation of emergency shelter statistics for the month of November 2024. There was no report turned in, so we don't have one to read. So I'll go on to the next. Item number 2, discussion regarding the creation of an entertainment overlay district and possible amendments to the noise ordinance. Mr. Knighton.
That is correct, Mayor, and thanks. We're going to sort of do this a little bit in reverse order and talk a little bit about our noise ordinance so that you guys have an understanding about how we currently enforce noise issues. And then that sort of dovetails into possibly looking at creating an entertainment overlay district. Currently, we have two methods of enforcing noise issues in Norman. The first one is the one that's primarily used by our police officers when they're responding to some noise complaint, and it's actually in section 24-403 of our ordinances. It's called disturbing the peace, and essentially that ordinance says no person shall disturb the peace of another. And subsection 3 is by playing or creating loud or unusual sounds. Now, that can be a bit subjective depending upon the circumstances. We had the fortune of litigating the constitutionality of that particular provision back in 2020. If you recall, it had to do with the abortion protesters out off of 24th and Lindsay. And essentially what the court said was that the city does have a legitimate interest or legitimate and substantial interest in protecting its citizens from unwelcome noise. Part of the issue in that case was the protesters on occasion were making enough noise to where people inside the facility could hear them audibly. And those people said it's having a negative impact on our ability to do our business. There were a couple of occasions when we got complaints from people in the Dillard building, which is a little bit to the west of that location, making the same complaint. They're loud enough outside where they're impacting our ability to do our business indoors. And again, we had oral argument in November of 2019, and then there was a follow-up in 2023 with another opinion that essentially said that our provision is narrowly tailored to serve the city's interest in protecting citizens from unwelcome noise as applies to demonstrators. So usually when the police go out, if there's a loud party or something along those lines, they will cite the person under the disturbing the peace provision in section 403. One of the issues for us with regard to this, I mentioned earlier, it can be a bit subjective, is to make it constitutional so that it's not vague. We usually have to apply a reasonable person standard. And what that means is, and the best example that I can give you is my neighbor in the summer on the weekends when it's hot will occasionally get up and start mowing his lawn at like 7 a.m. All right, if I were to complain about my neighbor mowing his lawn at 7 a.m. under this provision, the argument probably would be in a neighborhood in the summer in Oklahoma, it's reasonable to expect somebody might be mowing their lawn at 7 a.m. And that's not unreasonable. So in other words, I would be being unreasonable to say you should make my neighbor stop mowing his lawn. Now, same fact pattern, but my neighbor's mowing his lawn at midnight. Then you would say I wouldn't be unreasonable by saying my neighbor shouldn't be disturbing my peace by mowing his lawn at midnight, and therefore that probably would warrant a citation under disturbing the peace provision, notwithstanding it's the same activity, same location, it has to do with the time of day. And we do get occasions when we have to tell people, I understand you don't like the fact that your neighbor's making noise, but under this specific circumstances, it's not unreasonable for them to be making the noise that they're making. One of the arguments that the plaintiffs in Harmon tried to make had to do with game day at OU, saying that, well, you let the people on Campus Corner make all kinds of noise on game day. And yeah, that's true. That's a time-place issue. On game day at OU, on Campus Corner, we expect people to be making a lot of noise. And in fact, in that case, we had some video of those protesters on Campus Corner during game day using amplification to spread their message, and the answer is we're treating you the same way we treat everybody else on that particular day at that particular location. So with regard to a potential entertainment overlay district, we have to be cognizant of there are going to be people outside that district, and what's the expectation for those people? Because if we used to get, we don't really get anymore. I haven't heard one in a long time. People will be complaining about the noise from OU football games. That's been here at least 100 years, and you can expect on 6 or 7 Saturdays in the fall, there's going to be noise in that particular location, and there's nothing we can do about that, and it's not a violation of that provision in Section 24 of our ordinances. The other provision that we have that applies to noise is actually in Article 13, and it's essentially titled Noise Control. It was enacted in 1976. It has 12 provisions that define what the noise control issue, talking about our policy. City contracts require that our contractors comply with it. It has definitions and standards. It has use district levels, specifically about motor vehicle noise. This one relies heavily on sound level measurements. And then it has a separate provision that talks specifically about some of the noises that are prohibited, some exemptions, the opportunity to get a variance, and the penalties. What we tend to focus on in that provision, and it'll come clear as to why here in a second, is the provision in 16205 that talks about the use district noise levels. And subsection A1 prohibits creating a sound level that's greater than 15 decibels above the ambient sound level, L90, within any land use district during any measurement period. If you look at the table at the bottom, notice at the top it's got L90, L10, and L1. What that means is L90 is 90% of the time, L10 is 10% of the time, and L1 is 1% of the time. So those corresponding decibel levels at the L90 level, the sound would have to exceed, for example, for residential on that first one between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m., would have to exceed 50 decibels for 90% of whatever your measurement period is. And the measurement period for this particular ordinance has to be no less than 5 minutes and no more than 15 minutes.
Is that weighted by hour?
No, it is not. For A1, the first thing you have to do is you have to have an understanding of what the ambient sound level is. And of course, that's the sound level. If you didn't have whatever the noise-making issue that you're talking about, what's the decibel level without that particular activity? And once you get the ambient level, you would be looking for 15 decibels above the L90, the ambient sound level for 90% of the measurement period. A2 specifically creates a 90th percentile level, a 10 percentile level, and a first 1 percentile level. And then you can't exceed the measurements in that table within any of those specific use districts for those specific time periods. And our use districts are residential, commercial, and industrial. And then you'll see it's divided between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. And 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. And you're allowed to be a little bit louder during the day than you are during the night after 9 p.m. And then it gives you the different L90, L10, and L1 measurements. The difficulty with this is, again, it goes back to a measurement period should not be less than 5 minutes, no more than 15 minutes. The sound level measurements are required to be made with a type 2 sound level meter, type 2 or better, using the A-weighted scale in accordance and conforming with the standards promulgated by the American National Standards Institute. All right. The first one has to do with the ANSI standards. These are the ANSI standards. Our issue is these standards are primarily for workplace sound measurement. They really don't necessarily translate into measuring sound out in the field with regard to disturbing the peace type ordinances. And unfortunately, we have officers that are trained on how to operate the type 2 sound level meter, but we don't have officers that are trained on how to apply that under these ANSI standards. And if I were a defense attorney and you issued my client a citation under this provision, the first thing I'm going to say is, was the measurement taken in accordance with these standards? Because if it wasn't, then arguably those, whatever measurements were taken probably isn't sufficient to support a conviction for a violation of the noise provisions in Article 16. When we did the Hollywood Corners But when that was an issue out there, we had a guy come in, and I got his name on one of these slides, and he was actually a sound engineer. Really, really knowledgeable fella. Talked to Jeannie, and I actually came to the office and met with us and gave us a lot of information with regard to sound issues. And one of the things he talked about is the difference between an A-weighted scale and a C-weighted scale. An A-weighted scale de-emphasizes low and high frequencies because the human ear is less sensitive to these quieter levels. And what he was telling us is when you have music, especially loud music, it's not going to register as high on an A-weighted scale because the A-weighted scale doesn't get the high tones and the really low tones. So a lot of times when people are complaining about sound issues, they're complaining about what? They're complaining about the really low bass tones because those tend to travel a lot farther. And the A-weighted scale, when you're using that scale, really doesn't do a very good job of picking up the sound associated with those lower tones. What he had recommended was that if you're going to do that, if you're going to make some changes, one of the changes you should make is you should go to a C-weighted scale because the C-weighted scale uses or captures more of those higher and lower tones a lot better.
I have a question about the C-weighted scale, and if somebody was complaining about very loud bass shaking their windows, they had a photo of the window before the party and a photo of the window after the party, and there's a crack in it. Like, I know that's hard to, if they wanted to go after the person for like, hey, you're, breaking my windows, but. They had video of it where the window was shaking.
Well, for us, the question would be, we only do violations of our ordinance in municipal court. And if that person can come to court and testify that I was here at this date at this time, this person was making noise.
Here's video of the window.
Yeah, it was disturbing my peace.
Yeah.
And you would be submitting that as another piece of evidence as to volume. That's probably all we would be involved in. Now, if that person wanted to go to civil court to try to sue them for the damage as a result of the sound, then that would be their own deal. They could do that. Now, we do offer mediation in municipal court, and a lot of times in a case like that, if we send it to mediation and the reporting party or the victim sort of could get the defendant to agree to pay for the window and they agree to that, we would be fine with that. But that would be potentially a piece of evidence in a disturbing the peace prosecution, but we wouldn't be focusing on recovery for the damage. They'd have to do that in civil court.
Okay, so municipal versus civil.
Yeah. But again, the guy that we talked to did recommend in this context using a C-weighted scale for sound measurement as opposed to an A-weighted scale, which would require an amendment to that particular ordinance.
Do our sound level meters record in C?
Yes. Most sound levels are going to record in all of the levels. It's just a switch that you flip. I have a lot of people have, because you can buy apps on your phone that are supposed to be sound measurement. Now, they're not necessarily sound level meter type 2 or better, but they will give you a sort of a ballpark of what the particular noise is. And the one that I have on my phone does A. If you wanted to do the other ones, you have to pay. So sometimes that's what the issue is you can get one on your phone and it'll give you an idea, a ballpark as to what your level is, but for the other weighted scales, you sometimes have to pay. But again, if you have a commercial sort of enterprise, you probably should pay to figure out, the level that you're making to make sure that you're complying with our particular ordinance provisions. Have not seen a lot of citations under Article 16 because of the fact that it is kind of difficult to get that evidence. Very few people are going to stand out with a sound meter for 5 to 15 minutes to measure sound. And our officers, a lot of times, when they get there, the event's over. If you're having a loud party, by the time our officers showed up, if you turn the music down, there's nothing for them to measure. But again, that's why you have the provision with regard to disturbing the peace, because it does give that citizen the ability to sign the citation saying, this is what happened, and I want to move forward with prosecution.
For those that actually have, been cited, I think there was like a fraternity that had gotten a variance and had blown past that.
Variances are a little bit misleading
Okay,
because you can get a variance, but as a general rule, the only thing a variance gets you is one contact from the police to tell you your neighbor's complaining, you need to turn it down. So if you turn it down after that initial contact, you're not gonna get a citation. If you continue to be loud and they have to contact you again, as a general rule, you'll be cited.
okay.
A little bit further with regard to Article 16 and specifically as it relates to an entertainment overlay district, not only are there the provisions that set forth the decibel levels, we have some specific provisions in Section 208 that talk about specific activity. And one of them talks about public loudspeakers, and it prohibits using or operating a loudspeaker or sound amplifying equipment in a fixed or movable position, mounted on any sound vehicle or upon any street, alley, sidewalk, park, place, or public property, or transmitting music to any person or assemblages of persons in such a manner as to violate NCC 16205, and that's the decibel levels, or to create a noise disturbance unless a permit provided by NCC 16210 is first obtained. So under 16208, using public loudspeakers, which would include amplified music, is prohibited. You can't violate 16205. You can't create a noise disturbance unless you have a permit. But again, the permit's just going to get you one contact by the police to tell you you're too loud. Under 16208, a noise disturbance means any sound which annoys or disturbs reasonable persons with normal sensibilities or which injures or endangers the comfort, repose, health, hearing, peace, safety of other persons. So that goes back to what I mentioned earlier about us having to use that reasonable person standard. Although it's not necessarily articulated in the disturbing the peace provision, it is articulated in Section 208. And under 208, it can be a violation to either one, to violate the decibel levels, or two, to create a noise disturbance. So even though you may not have a decibel reading under 16208, if that person can come to court and testify that you created a noise disturbance, I'm reasonable, and the noise you were making disturbed me or injured me, it's still possible for that person to be convicted under 16208B3 with regard to public loudspeakers. So a little bit of a hybrid, a little bit different. Not sure why the council in 1976 thought that this was necessary on top of disturbing the peace, but it does have those provisions, and we do need to keep those in consideration when talking about how to go about crafting an entertainment overlay district. The two instances that we've had the occasion to look at this issue specifically, the first one was Hollywood Corners back in 2018. The noise issue was resolved by a SPUD, and that SPUD specifically requires compliance with the decibel levels in 16205, but it has a map of the area, and there are certain locations on that map where you're supposed to go to measure those decibel levels. The gentleman, and his name is David Pizzini, when he came and visited with Jeannie and I, talked about the fact that whatever your decibel level is, every time you double the distance, the decibel level decreases by 3 decibels. So if you're measuring 50 decibels at 10 feet, if you double the distance to 20 feet, the decibel level would go down to 47, and so on and so forth. So since that SPUD was passed, I don't specifically recall us having, we may have had a couple of instances at Hollywood Corners where people were calling to complain about noise, but not a whole lot. The second one was in May of 2023. That was Midway Grocery, the same issue. It was resolved with a SPUD. That SPUD requires compliance with the noise ordinance, again, those decibel levels, and then they cannot have any amplified sound earlier than 12 p.m. or no later than 9 p.m., and the events can only be on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday only. So when we've encountered the issue about outdoor entertainment, here recently we have resolved them with special plan unit development. And the question obviously becomes, do we still want to do it on a case-by-case manner using that process, or do we want to create some overlay district to where it's a use, either special use or use as a matter of right, so that they don't really have to go through that rezoning process in order to get approval to do some sort of outdoor entertainment. But again, when we do that, we probably need to take into consideration both the disturbing the peace ordinance and then the provisions in Article 16.2 to make sure that we're not creating a set of circumstances where the overlay district comes into conflict with those noise provisions.
I'm a little curious, when you say by right versus special use, what is the process? I mean, obviously by right you get to do it.
Right.
The special use portion, is that like an application?
Yes, you'd have to get a special use approved by council for that particular use at that particular
It's
location.
not so the same intensity as going through a spud process. It should not like put too much burden on the applicant
That's
for.
correct. Yes,
And is there a fee associated with the special use?
yes.
Okay. How much?
Jane would know that.
I've got it in my slide too.
I was just gonna
Yeah.
say the
Special
Logan's
use
thing
zoning
is,
is 400.
like if Campus Corner was in an entertainment overlay, Logan's would have had to come get our approval to stay in business, basically. Took up 2 years ago.
Well, they can pull up their bar.
Yeah.
Right, but if the entertainment district allowed a bar by right,
Okay,
right,
and that.
then they wouldn't have had to, whatever it cost, they wouldn't have had to, we approved it, but.
I mean, I like the idea of an entertainment district overlay, but I also like having guardrails. So, I mean, just as somebody who represents the Corps and have had noise complaints from fraternities to, actually Midway, but, you know, one of the things actually that I think after the spud for Midway that helped resolve some issues was something we were talking about, coming up with noise ordinance amendment to that, which was like having the number on site or where the people in the neighborhood know that you called the venue to address the noise, and if it's unresolved through that route, then you like escalate it up. And that seems to have been really effective so far. But that's not like a requirement anywhere.
Currently, no, it's not.
I think it was kind of part of that good neighbor
Yes.
idea, like sign off.
Well, and then the other thing that goes with that is one of the things that Jane has in her presentation was a requirement of us, if you have an overlay district and if you're going to have some sort of event that potentially is going to generate a lot of noise, to require a sound engineer to sign off on the acoustic plans. When we met with Mr. Pizzini back during the Hollywood Corner issue, one of the things that he was telling us, now, we didn't necessarily look deep into his credentials, but he said he's designed the sound system in a lot of really big arenas. So he was very well versed with regard to how to go about doing that. And what he was telling us is, from a sound engineering perspective, there is a way to design your venue such that it will have a minimal impact on the surrounding neighbors. And when we talked to Hollywood Corners, the question was, well, who does your sound? And the answer was, well, we have a guy that just, he pretty much just knows, he sets up the equipment and he knows how to turn the volume up and down. That's about it. And what our guy was saying, or Mr. Pizzini was saying, is in terms of how you position the speakers, the way you direct them, the type of speakers, does anybody here go to church that has a drummer in a cage? Any idea why the drummer's in the cage? The drummer's in the cage because being in the cage allows the soundboard person to control how loud the drums are. So that the drumming can't overwhelm the other instrument. That's why you put the drum in a cage. The guy on the soundboard knows how to control the sound. That's one of the things that he was recommending for Hollywood Corners. A lot of the issue was because of the drumming. Put the drummer in a cage, and then your sound guy can control how loud the drummer is, and if it's too loud, he can turn it down. The issue had to do with, in terms of soundproofing on their stage. When it became an issue, they just hung up a bunch of like blankets, and he was saying that's not going to resolve the problem. You need some soundproofing, some material that's soundproof that's going to help direct that sound more towards your audience and less out into the neighborhood. And in his opinion, if you hire a true sound engineer, that person is going to help you to be able to minimize the impact that sound is going to have on the surrounding neighborhood, while also allowing your customers to be able to have an experience that you would expect to have if you went to a concert. So that's one of the things I think, when we're thinking about the noise part of it, would be helpful if we were to incorporate that into some sort of an overlay district, is when you're going to have those events, you probably need to have a true actual sound engineer reviewing and signing off on how your setup is gonna be.
And have setup stations that are fixed. We can measure from there.
Well, you could, I mean, that's something you could do anyway. I mean, again, it goes back to the way that our decibel, our noise ordinance is written. In terms of the measurement, you're supposed to be measuring it from the affected property. So you would go, if my neighbor down the street was making a lot of noise, you would come to my house and measure it from there to see if it exceeded those decibel levels. Part of the problem, we're having an issue at the rail house at one point in time, because they were sponsoring like fraternity sorority parties. There were some people to the west that were complaining. So I went out one evening when there was nothing going on to try to see, and this was to try to get an understanding of one, how the meter worked, and number two, what the ambient level was. And the wind was blowing, and it pushed that meter way past what the acceptable limit was. A lot of times we have problems with noise. It comes at the boundary of two different use districts. When you have residential and commercial that border each other, that tends to be where the conflict occurs. On East Lindsay, in that shopping mall, there used to be a gym, and the gym had exhaust fans. And one of the neighbors across the alley, which is residential, was complaining about the noise from the exhaust fans. So me and one of our former police officers took the old decibel meter out into his backyard to see what the level was with regard to those exhaust fans, to see how it compared with our the provisions in 16205. And there was a plane flying over. We had to wait for the plane to fly over because the plane was exceeding the limits with regard to that particular decibel reading. He also had his air conditioner in the backyard, and it kicked on, and it made the meter go above what the acceptable level is for residential. So it can be a little bit difficult or complicated with regard to how you go about making those measurements. And we didn't do it in accordance with these standards. We were just doing it to get an idea as to what the levels would look like, and they weren't anywhere close to exceeding the levels in our ordinance based on those circumstances.
Well, I've sat in our backyard when the neighbor to the east of me and the neighbor to the south of me have the same landscaper. So when they come and they mow, or they come and they blow leaves or whatever, you get 3 or 4 blowers going all at one time, and it's too loud to sit out there. Not that I have to necessarily, that's the reason, the thing to do, go inside.
But I think part of what's going to go with this is really going to have a lot to do with the expectations, because, and you talked a little bit earlier about the fraternity sorority issue, or the fraternity issue. Our thought process from a prosecution perspective sometimes is they were there, you knew they were there when you moved there, so you're going to have to expect some noise. It's just not going to be totally quiet.
I would say some of it has evolved.
Some of it has
since
gone
people
way
have-
over and above what's
Yeah.
reasonable, and there was a case that we dealt with where it was kids playing basketball at midnight, really loud rap music with expletives, and it's like, that's unreasonable. That's just unreasonable. I don't necessarily like the expletive part, but if it was during the day, if it was 4 or 5 p.m., they're out there playing basketball, probably going to say that you're going to have to tolerate a little bit of that. But again, one of the things that talked about with regard to noise regulations, specifically from a First Amendment perspective, is time, place, manner. And if your time, place, manner ordinance is reasonable, then the court's going to uphold it and you'll be done with that. But that's what we're talking about with those issues is time, place, manner. One of the other ones that Jeannie, I cannot remember that guy's name. It was the guy who lived in the detached garage, and his neighbor would work on cars in the evening.
Over on Nebraska?
Yes, I forgot that guy's name. But anyway, he doesn't like me. Yeah, he doesn't like me because his neighbor would go work on cars in the evening, and he would use power tools, a drill, a saw, something. It's like 4 or 5 p.m. in the evening. I said, you understand, number one, you live in a detached garage that's not insulated. It really wasn't built for somebody to live in, but the people converted it. You live there. He's in his backyard. He's in the garage. He uses power tools intermittently. That's probably not going to be something we prosecute it for. one point in time, he may have issued a citation, and the neighbor hired an attorney. The attorney went out and had sound levels measurements done under that particular provision, and the power tools he was using didn't exceed those levels. So again, going back to the reasonable person standard, that was just another piece of evidence for us to be able to say, look, even if we use these sound measurements, it's not exceeding those levels. It's probably really going to be difficult for us to justify prosecuting this guy because we don't like the fact that he works on his cars in the evening. But we got to, again, depending upon where you do the overlay district, if it's more downtown commercial and it doesn't really go out past that, probably not going to be that big of a deal. But the closer you get to residential type development, it's going to become more of an issue.
I would just add to that, where does downtown end? Because, if you're saying Porter to the east is the boundary, you still have some commercial development that touches a neighborhood. And to some extent, if you're the business owner and you're getting complaints from the nearby community about the events you're allowing, like there was one very loud party with lights, beaming into the neighborhood. In that case, those people knew the owner, were calling to get it shut down. But it's like, yes, we want to allow this, but also, what is reasonable? You have a toddler. Well, the lady who called the building owner was like, hey, I'm trying to put my kid to sleep, and you have this wild party with lights flashing into our house. So, maybe, I don't know if it escalated up to the police or whatever, but, is there something to delineate, like when you're on the edge of an overlay district versus in the center of it?
I think that's something you guys would have to think about and make that determination with regard to creating an overlay
And
district.
that's what I was thinking of. Every time I bring up this problem in my mind, I go down to French Quarter, New Orleans. You hear music, noise, people. That's part of the charm in some people's opinion of why you're down there. In the campus corner, you want that noise, you want that energy. I mean, the band, half the band comes down there and plays sometimes, marching down there. That's what you want. I would imagine that describing districts like a TIF, these are the boundaries on it. And then we can figure out some kind of noise deal. Because to me, it'd be a difference between if it was existing, if we decided to do this downtown, and these people have been living there for 40 years. Nobody had ever done this before. Now they're subjected to it versus somebody who we put it in an area and then they build apartments afterwards because it's obvious what's going on there. If you get an apartment there, you shouldn't expect it to be Hollywood, which gets noisy too.
Right.
I was wondering, a couple slides ago, there was, this ordinance was written in 1976.
Yes.
But it referred to speakers on the outsides of vehicles. Do our noise ordinances only refer to speakers on the outsides of vehicles, or does it pertain to loud music coming from inside the car as well?
There is another provision, I didn't put it in this one, but 16206 specifically applies to motor vehicle noise. So the boom cars there's 16206, and then with regard to noises prohibited, there's another one that talks about motor vehicle noise specifically. 16208 for noise prohibited has a whole bunch of different categories of noises that are prohibited. And the decibel levels on some of them are a little bit different, but it would apply to vehicle noise and not just speakers on the outside of the vehicle.
Would it be of any benefit to shorten the observation time?
I'd have to go and look and do a little bit more research specifically with regard to the ANSI standards. And I know the reason you do 90, 10, and 1 is because sound is going to peak. And if it just peaks for a moment, it appears as though this ordinance really wasn't intended to criminalize that particular wasn't intended to criminalize that particular behavior. It has to be that loud for at least, again, 1% of that time. And I have this running just because the average, since I've been sitting here with my phone at that distance, the average has been 64.3 decibels, and the max has been 79.9. Now, obviously, if this were an issue about prosecution, you would have to take this measurement at whatever the boundary was from the affected property, but it's not that difficult to exceed those levels.
Would we be able to, if we did overlay districts, have more of a concentrated area and then maybe a peripheral area? So like this, kind of like I think of a storm map where the red area is got a higher decibel level allotment, and then as you move out from that area, it has a weaker allotment, so you kind of gradually move back into it.
Sure, I think you could.
I'd like to add to that, because that's where my mind was going. And then also maybe the times permitted, like in the center of the overlay district, you could have like a longer time period. You know, if you're a band playing at a venue, you could go till 12 or 2, I guess. But if you're on the edges of an entertainment overlay district, maybe you're only going to 9 or 10.
Right.
Versus 2 a.m. Actually, I was gonna say, like, when we do Norman Music Fest, they have to be done by 12, I think.
Right.
So,
For outdoor stuff.
Yes,
I
right.
believe so.
On that same, I mean, part of the intent too, when we started talking about this years ago, was just trying to get ahead of and avoid some issues that maybe places like Austin have experienced, where you've got a bar district and there's live music venues, and then over time, residential development, apartments start being built around that district. And then those new residents start complaining about the live music venues being too loud and there being a conflict there. And it's, well, the venues were there first, isn't that why you moved there? Or moved into the apartment down there? And so, you know, I think we all want to see residential development on Campus Corner and Main Street and Clay Street, downtown in general. But I also wouldn't want established businesses in those two areas to then have new residents complaining about their live music or and then there was also an issue with, there was a Campus Corner business that they're not doing it anymore, but they had, the speakers are still mounted on the outside of the building, they just don't play anything out of them anymore, or I haven't noticed. But for a while they were, and at least until 11 or midnight, and you could hear it all across all of Campus Corner. It was very loud out there, and so people would ask, how can the police drive by here? Do they not hear that going on? Why are they, and how are they allowed to do that? And, you know, and then they'd stop doing it anyway. But, you know, there was a guy that lived on Campus Corner above the bike shop, and he complained about those speakers blasting
Yeah,
above Campus
and
Corner.
there was it's kind of an urban legend, and it was way before my time, and allegedly we had a former judge whose opinion was a police officer's peace cannot be disturbed. So I think over time that's just sort of been sort of the urban legend that's sort of gone along with police officers and their training. So
If they hear it and as they're driving by, they should be able to just
yeah,
do something.
because of that understanding about one of our prior judges, it's if the police officer is the only person hearing it, then the judge is going to say your peace can't be disturbed, so there's no basis for moving forward with citation. So you would have had to have a citizen be the complaining witness.
That a police officer's peace cannot be disturbed.
Right.
Okay. And so it had to be something reported, and
Right.
then an officer is specifically responding to that.
Correct.
Because some, I think, folks would think that there's this loud party in the neighborhood, surely the police are going to hear that, and they're going to, like, I don't need to call the police, they're going to go get it anyway. But you're saying the police, that's not really how it works.
Right. That's the difficulty. And, you know, part of the difficulty with this has to do with, again, we're all different, and different things bother different people. Some people aren't really bothered as much by noise, whereas others are really sensitive. So again, if a police officer driving by and hears a loud party, I had one time, we lived in it, before we moved into the house we live in now, we lived in a duplex. And my neighbor was having his 30th birthday party. He came over and said, we might be loud, a little bit loud over the weekend, or this week because we're having our party. It wasn't loud at all. At least nothing that I thought was over and above what would be problematic. Now, there may have been somebody else living in that same location that if they heard anything, they would have immediately been on the phone call to the police. So that's a little bit of the difficulty for us is, and for the PD is, if nobody's complaining, maybe everybody that lives in that neighborhood's at the party.
Yeah.
So there's nobody to complain. So again, as a general rule, the police department's gonna wait till they get a complaint. Again, because you've had that prior understanding that a police officer's peace cannot be disturbed.
Well, and there was the issue too, when we were having all of our meetings on Zoom and from home, when I was still living on college, and the house behind me was that year occupied by some people that were some students. It was like an off-site fraternity house for sure. And they would, they had a hot tub in the backyard, and they would, just as loud as it could go until 4 and 5 in the morning. But they were doing it during a council meeting when I was trying to do Zoom, and everybody could hear like the bass in the background and the whole thing. I think Daryl said something over it, but you know, that was kind of the most egregious I'd ever been around. But I agree with the part about like Mr. Pizzini back then when he was talking about the bass. I mean, I feel like that's what really gets, like you can feel it like resonating through your whole body when it's really loud. Being able to measure it in that sense, I think, makes sense. And I think that was it I had about that's all I had about the noise ordinance part. I have some more comments about the entertainment or the overlay district part.
Well, perhaps the standard that we're using is incorrect, because as you say, when I learned this in school, this is an industrial standard, and it was to stop injuring ears.
Correct.
Because you're grinding or you're doing some function to be able to do it. Maybe there's, I don't know if there's an irritation factor, okay, that would be reasonable of some sort that can be, if it's that C-weighted scale, like going to Campus Corner and hearing loud noises shouldn't bother you. Going to a game day shouldn't bother you. A neighborhood, like several of my neighborhoods have pool parties during the early games and stuff like that. They get noisy. They're having fun. It's cheerful noise. It's not boom, 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 boom. But you can hear them having fun. What's the matter with that? If I don't like it, I can curmudgeon up and do something different. So maybe it's the standard that we're measuring this by, that's bad English.
Well, this is really an evidentiary issue.
Okay.
And council could have put anything in the ordinance they wanted to with regard to how to go about taking those sound measurements. Again, I don't know what was going on in 76. I don't know why they chose ANSI, but again, when you look at this document, it really is about workplace sound level measurements.
Now, OSHA chooses.
Yeah, the only thing I saw in here that I thought was of any significance was the fact as to where you have to take the measurements from. It's supposed to be at shoulder height, which goes, okay, that makes a little bit of sense in terms of sound getting to your ears from a workplace perspective. I don't know that it necessarily has a whole lot to do with sound level measurement when we're talking about noise created by an entertainment venue.
Okay.
I mean, it's going to be pretty consistent. I don't think the height is going to really matter that much.
But I would imagine that some noises, like you said, the very low bass noises, and for me, the very high pitched.
Well, what was interesting when Jeannie and I visited with Mr. Panini, one of the things he demonstrated for us is women tend to hear higher frequencies better than men do. Because he played something and Jeannie could hear it and I couldn't.
She's got mom hearing.
But yeah, when we're talking about the entertainment, those are the things I think we need to keep into consideration from a noise ordinance perspective to make sure that we're not, that we're consistent with making sure our noise ordinance doesn't, or our entertainment overlay district does not conflict with our noise provisions. So now I get the tag team with Jane.
There was just one, or a couple of things I did want to mention though, was so Norman High football field, Harv Collins, we had complaints about that before, about it being too loud. Recently, planes at the airport, and then cars and motorcycles, loud cars and motorcycles revving up. I know I've got complaints about it. I've witnessed it happening on Campus Point pretty often, the cars doing their thing. So those are things where it's like it's a noise. How does that work?
In the provisions in Article 16, there's a specific exemption for scholastic events.
For
Scholastic events. Schools, events sponsored by a school, there's a specific exemption in Article 16 for that. When we had the litigation in the Harmon case, that was one of the arguments that was being made, was about how come you guys don't prosecute or issue citations to cars and vehicles when they go by. And there's a concept of transient noise. If it's just momentary and it's going by and it's gone, that's probably not something that ordinance was meant to prohibit. What's interesting about that is, I said oral argument for that case was November of 2019, and I stayed in a hotel in downtown Denver. And of course, you're nervous, you can't sleep. And I just remember that night hearing motor vehicles. I'm on the 6th floor in a downtown hotel, and I can hear car noise going back and forth all freaking night, because that's what's going through my head is, obviously I'm there for disturbing the peace or argument, but the issue is those types of transient noises, I mean, unless they're just really excessive, are probably not something that the ordinance was meant to prohibit.
Well, more so when they're in a parking lot, like on Campus Corner or over on Lindsay and Classic is another issue. I know that's
Right.
lately, but several cars parking in a parking lot and seeing who can rev their engine up the highest, fastest, with
That-
the loudest noise.
It probably would prohibit that. That probably would be a little bit different. And I'm just more talking about, in my bedroom, we border, we're on Ridgemont Circle. I can hear cars go by back and forth. And now, the location on Boyd, where the new hotel is going to be, there used to be a house right across the street on the north side. And I used to live in that house, and it's right next to the railroad tracks. And my bedroom was on this side of the house, the east side next to the railroad tracks. And I never recall being awakened by a train, because I think at some point in time you become a little bit conditioned to those noises and they don't really bother you. But something like that gets a little bit excessive, the noise ordinance probably would prohibit.
Two thoughts. So it sounds like we would update our noise ordinance,
Yes.
fine tune it, and while we explore this entertainment district overlay situation. Also, with the transient car noise, I remember for a stretch I was getting complaints about drag racing, and is that something, I mean, really hard to catch, I'm sure, but if it's happening at certain times frequently, do we
Yes.
have we enforced that?
And on 72nd for a while, there was a Facebook page, kids would go out and race out there. We have a number of citations there, I think it's 77.
So,
Mad Facebook meetup or something.
so basically, residents need to call in the drag racing, especially if it's happening with frequency at certain times or certain days of the
That's
week.
been a while. I mean, we do cite individual cars when they take off the stoplight and then all of a sudden racing and both cars get stopped.
Well, I just had someone get testy with me when I said call the cops, because you gotta report it so it becomes data and they know how to do their patrols, and they were like, what do you mean? But I mean, obviously this is the way we
Yes.
keep track of it and actually do something about it.
They do if they can get there.
Yeah,
But usually it's an officer near the intersection and the two cars take off.
yeah,
I've seen them bust them up on Campus Corner now, because they're already down there usually.
yeah.
So,
We have 10 minutes left, and our price is gonna shut us down.
Oh, dang.
Can you get done, or do you want us to wait until another?
No, actually, if it's okay, what I'd like to do, so I have a PowerPoint, but it's really, I mean, it's stuff that you're already very familiar with. A lot of this stuff Rick already covered, and with your questions, and once gone back So we've been here in, what was it? So, we came in 16, we came in 19. I'm hearing, so Councilmember Holman is talking about Campus Corner. I know when we came forward, a couple of other times, we were talking about Main Street. We had right, we had the dueling outdoor
Dueling
use.
patios.
Dueling patios, yes. And
Yeah.
we had just never gotten past this discussion as far as, so when we're talking about Main Street, we do have several property owners that have come forward and have special use for the residential on the second floor. So I really don't know how many apartments we have down on Main Street now, but we have several. And that had always been the hiccup when we talked about it before was, the existing residential in place down there. What would we do? Do we want that to actually be the overlay district we want to start with, or was it Campus Corner? We talked about that as well. So I guess really I want to get direction from you and then come back again. Do you want to specifically look at Campus Corner? Is there a specific area you want us to focus on? And then what I had in here actually was looking at creating special use within C2 or C3. But if you're wanting to look at a specific area and have that overlay, there's no need to do that as a special use within those zoning districts. So what do you want?
So I guess two main goals of that would be Campus Corner and downtown are two most existing entertainment districts, I guess you could say. There's other nodes around, but they already have established venues and bars and restaurants, places that generate noise and activity, but both of them also have residential on them, in them, and the potential for more of it to come. So it's kind of trying to get ahead of potential conflicts between established businesses and new residential. And I don't know about existing residents downtown, if any of them are complaining about bars. I mean, good friend Rhett Jones used to live above Bison Witches, but then they built a stage that happens to be underneath the bedroom of that upstairs apartment. So he doesn't live there anymore. And I think they use it as an office now. But, this wouldn't do anything about that, but that was like, he just moved to a different apartment. And I don't know if there's any conflict currently with existing residents, but just trying to get ahead of if we have a lot more residents. If somebody builds an apartment building on Gray Street and they start complaining about Red Brick Bar and Blue Bonnet and Nopolis, and it's like, well, those businesses have been there for decades. They've been having stuff there. And then the other part was kind of because of the Logies thing, and just I've kind of always thought if somebody wanted to open a bar, they should be able to. You can open a restaurant by right, or a gas station, or whatever else under certain zonings. Then maybe venue is different. If you're going to be having live music, maybe there is still an approval thing. But like if somebody just wanted to, in an entertainment overlay district, wanted to got a lease on a storefront and they wanted to put a bar in there that didn't serve any food. Like I don't necessarily think council has to vote on every. And with the Logies thing, I didn't think, even though it went through and I think unanimously, I just was like, I don't think this guy, he's been in business for 17 years in the same location. Why should he have to come through this just to keep going in business? And what if we had said no? And then it's like, oh, he's got to close his business basically after all this time. So
Yes, sir.
I was curious, when we were talking about downtown Norman and Campus Corner the most, but would the site plan for the city center TIF make sense to just kind of look at that and see if that would be a good overlay and then kind of grow and expand from there? And that would also protect the development that's gone into that portion of town, like the little Rock House bar. I mean, those, with us getting rid of parking minimums and doing plans like this, then those little neighborhood places can kind of pop up more. And kind of setting that precedent will allow them to exist because people won't move into those areas without knowing, like, hey, you're in the party zone, essentially.
is that allowed in Center City? I can't remember. Because Logies is not, Campus Campus Corner's not in the Center City form-based code.
That's what I'm saying, just like use Center City and
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of like draw some lines out from there
Yeah.
to see.
And that would still, if that is still included UNP and probably Griffith when we look at it, because we don't know what's going on. I've heard people wanting to put in band shells and things like that. I think it's a wonderful idea, but I don't live there, and neither do many people. But the people that are on Carter might care. And so,
There's
that's,
a lot of future residents
Could be.
living there, so.
but then, I think you're right on the idea of something that's there existing is existing. If you move next to it, if I move next to an auto body shop, I should hear auto body fixing noises.
Yeah.
That's why I don't do it.
Living on college, I have a certain expectation that there's gonna be activity going on around here. That one just happened to go above the threshold. But,
Speaking for our neighborhood, most of us have figured that out. We know, by 10:30, we really need to be quiet. Don't start a lawnmower, don't do something like that, unless you just have to.
Yeah.
So,
When you're asking for direction to look at specific spots, what would be the difference between Campus Corner and downtown as an area of study for this?
I don't think there really would be much difference.
Okay.
You know, I just wanted, because we are limited on time, I just wanted to see what you thought, the areas that you would be interested in doing the overlay. We want to visit with Greg and see what changes you would suggest, or how the noise ordinance would change.
I was gonna say, some spots might be, I'm not really sure about Campus Corner as far as obviously you have the game day activities, but in downtown, you're gonna have an art walk, you're gonna have a Norman Music Fest, and in theory, these are things that are attracting people to come live here. I guess if I was gonna look at downtown specifically, I would be thinking about being protective of the businesses that created the culture that makes it so attractive to live there. But maybe perhaps because you are moving into this area, and I know, if you're a business, you want people to live nearby and frequent your business. But maybe there's we had discussed with the noise ordinance update, that good neighbor agreement, everybody is pretty aware of what's coming and when, so they can plan accordingly. And I feel that works too for fraternities and sororities who are mindful of the communities they live around. It's not every, year that you have the same group, but those groups that are conscientious of their neighbors will go over and say, hey, we're gonna have a party, here's our contact. There's a lot to be said for doing that kind of groundwork before you end up in situations where somebody's potentially getting sued later.
So,
I've got to exit there because we're on that.
okay, so we have 1 minute. So are you, collectively, are you more interested in the ability for business owners to not have to come to council to have special use for a bar? Or are you more interested in getting the live entertainment, or is it called?
I would say both.
I would be thinking both, and maybe it's more than that, I don't know, but entertainment district, those types of things where they might have to come to get a special use permit now, even if they're an existing business. The ownership changes and they lose it or something, like with Old Castle. And then we voted not to renew it for them, but it failed. And it's it's not a venue anymore, it's a martial arts venue.
I know we have to stop, but I will say, I do remember when we talked about the Main Street area many years ago, maybe it was the 16 group, it was generally